All right, welcome to the live event, the daily live event, Monday to Friday. And I put this on to use my transformation tool, the 7-step reset, to help people cope with the uncertainty, the volatility, the ambiguity, basically the VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And that leads to what people are calling BANI, brittle, anxiousness, nonlinear, and incomprehensible. So that's the experience. The VUCA's external, it's not going away. If you consider Moore's law back in 1970 or so, said that technology capability will double every 18 months. We are on the extremely steep vertical part of that exponential curve. If you've looked at a curve where you've doubled something 20 times, like take a penny, for example, you double it 20 times, it's $10 million. That last two or three doublings are on the steep part. Well, we are easily into 20 years, more than 20 years, doubling, 20 times doubling, I should say, in that Moore's law, and we're seeing it, right? Because if you consider the internet was just 25 years ago, generally speaking, the dot-com bubble. Obviously, the internet was available before then, but it exploded around 2000 in terms of serving mankind. And then you had the social media, and that exploded when Facebook went public. That started exploding when it was being monetized. That was around 2010 to 2012 or 13, and it went on to mobile. And here we are in 2025 with artificial intelligence. And even with artificial intelligence, we're seeing that change rapidly. So the initial OpenAI was so expensive compared to what is capable now, and it's just going to get faster and faster. So for those people who are thinking that learning AI today and that's the end of it, no, because AI is now able to help us accelerate even more. So the steep part is here to stay, and what we have to do is learn to like Good to Great and Jim Collins. We need approaches that are simple, methodical, and consistent. We need to know that tomorrow and the next day and the next day, when we wake up, we're going to be just fine, and we'll be able to cope. And the reason is not because we're reacting to everything so quickly, but because we have a methodology that works no matter what's happening around us. You see, when you base your life on principles, you are guaranteed that the world will conform around you, because the principles are principles. Gravity is a principle. You know that the world will conform around you, and you can have peace in that. So you want simple and methodical. You don't want to be reacting. And today we're talking about step 7 in the 7-step reset. The 7-step reset is my tool that I use with clients in the 90-day program, the 90-day transformation program, where we run laps around the first 4 of the 7 performance areas. Those 7 performance areas are mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and then relationship, professional, and financial. So the right side is it's not fully in our control. We need to interact with other people. Relationships takes more than one person. Professional, buyers need sellers, leaders need followers, and vice versa. And then financial, and you could argue that you're in a financial trader, so it's just you, but you still is buyer and a seller on each side of that. And there are players that are involved in building the algorithms that the big houses are trading with. So there's still people. You do not control that. You do not control whether or not people create more algorithms or whether or not people game the system and et cetera. So there's these over here, relationship, professional, and financial, are only partially in our control. So we have to manage what we can do. We can do the mental, physical, spiritual, for sure. I don't think anybody would disagree with that. The emotional one becomes the one that's suspect, because we walk around with these buttons and people know where the buttons are. They can push them. And as they push the buttons, we get triggered. So you don't want to have that process able to trigger you. Hold on a second. You don't want to have this process of being easily triggered by external events or by people nefarious. Now, for centuries, we've been operating with advertisers, and advertisers know and understand cognitive biases. And there are people who are working 12 hours a day, paid big money to figure out how to get you to do what you wouldn't ordinarily do. And they do that with ad copy. And one of the tenets of ad copy is you start with pain and you stir it up and you amplify it. So no wonder people are walking around anxious. And now, because artificial intelligence, the way it learned was by consuming everything on the internet, and which is interesting in itself because the internet didn't really explode until it wasn't available until the early 90s, but it didn't explode until after that. And so there's a lot of information that was added to the internet. But for those of us who grew up in the pre-computer era, we know that there's a lot of things that we know that aren't really talked about much because we just knew them. And it's interesting. I was doing some research and I was looking into, so there's the 6 human needs: certainty, variety, significance, connectedness, growth, and contribution. And the idea is that the first 4, significance and, or I should say certainty and variety, those two are, there's tension there, right? You start getting more variety and you feel uncertain. You start getting more certainty and you need variety. So we're like struggling. If you focus on those two, if you focus on the significance and the connectedness, the same thing. The more connected you become, the less significance you feel. And then that becomes tension. So you go after one and then you're whipsawing back and forth. And the idea is that you ignore the first 4 and you focus on the last 2, growth and contribution. And it's interesting because almost every book that you pick up that talks about, or guide that talks about what to do if you're depressed, it one of the things that are in there is to help other people, volunteer, go do this, help somebody in need. And it's because when we're focusing on other people, we start to feel at our best. And so growth and contribution, by focusing there, you get enough variety and certainty. You get enough significance and connectedness, and it happens organically versus trying to go after it. So growth and contribution. So I was looking up the 6 human needs because a few years ago, well, probably 15 years ago, I took on the project of mapping the 6 human needs over to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So the physiological, and then the security, love needs, and esteem needs, and then self-actualization. And an interesting thing about that is those needs are based on rules that you create. And you can, so the idea of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, just as a refresher, is that you can't focus on the second need until the first one is taken care of. So if I imagine, if you dropped out on a deserted island, there's no one around, the first thing you have to do is find food and water. That's the physiological need. You need food and water. And then you have to deal with safety and shelter because there's weather and there's animals. So that's the second need. But you can't worry about safety and shelter so much until you've eaten and you're hydrated. Now you could do the shelter needs. That's number 2. Once shelter and you feel safe, then you could start thinking about a love needs. And it's interesting because if you're on that deserted island by yourself, you understand that as you love the animals, express love for nature, the oxytocin is released and that love need is met. And that's what makes you start thinking, wait a minute. So do these needs need to be met externally? No, they don't. And then the third need is esteem. So I feel good about myself. And this started because I said, well, if I recognize myself, I don't need recognition from other people. And because I look in the mirror in the morning and I recognize myself as a play on words, a double entendre, et cetera. So I'm saying, I recognize myself. That's who I am. I recognize me. And that recognition, the play on words, is that I now have esteem because I'm being recognized. That it's a play, but who says it has to be logical for the subconscious to own it? This was years before I was doing this work, like the 7 steps and the 7 performance areas, etc. So then I was able to focus on self-actualization. I was able to focus on self-actualization and I didn't have to wait for these first 4 needs to be met. And the point is, you set the rules for how you meet those needs. You set the rules for how much food and water you need. Kind of, right? I mean, but if you look at what we take in and how we have to live, you need blood. That's live with seconds without blood, minutes without oxygen, days without water. I'm sorry, yeah, days without water and weeks or months without food. And so it kind of tells you the order. Once you take care of your basal needs, then you can go into the shelter. So if you have your those two needs met at the level that you decide. So if you're just starting out, if you just out of school or whatever, you're just on your own, or you moved out of your home, if you're a young person, if you're an older person and you're figuring it out, once you get those two needs met, you can decide that your love needs are met. You can decide that your esteem needs are met. You don't need that to come from somebody else. You can work out the rules so that they're met every single day just by existing. And I'll talk a little bit about that today in this as we go into step 7. And then that allows you to focus on self-actualization. And self-actualization, by design, is going to include other people. So I always say we start with purpose. In fact, I don't even do the engage in a 90-day transformation program unless a person has something they're going after. Proxy for purpose is fine, but it has to be something that's bigger than them, because there's going to be valleys and there's going to be hard times, and I need them to have something that's big enough and important enough to them to be able to go through that. So I asked the question, why is that important? Multiple times, maybe even 7 or 8 times. Why is that important? Okay, and what about that makes it so critical? And because I want to have something that they're willing to crawl over broken glass for before we start the 90-day transformation. And then the 7-step reset is used to do the laps, because there's going to be several barriers and stories. You can look at some of my earlier videos and you'll see what I talk about crossing that barrier. When we go above that artificial ceiling that's above us, there's a barrier above that ceiling. That barrier includes all the beliefs and stories we taught ourselves, the habitual patterns, the self-image, all of that is in that barrier. And as we try and cross that barrier, we get triggered, which is why people come back down, because neurons that fire together wire together, and those stories, beliefs, etc., trigger those feelings, that anxiety, that emotion, and then we come back down because of fear of failure or whatever it is. And that's why we need the 7-step reset, because we have to process that. Now it gets easy. It gets much easier as you go along. So today we'll cover step 7, and I want to do it in a way that kind of brings this home. So one of the things I talk about quite a bit is the subconscious is not a mind. It's the network of neurons. And that's the first step. If you can't get that, we stay there, right? We have to stay there until you can see that the subconscious is actually a physiological thing, that cognitive processing is the network of neurons versus thinking is the conscious mind. And we use that language, and I'm a stickler for that, because meaning has words, or I say words have meaning. And if you're using the words, the tendency will always be to revert to words that reinforce what you've always believed and always thought to be true. And this is why sometimes if you're listening to these events in the morning or watching these events, you might think, oh yeah, that's just like this. Oh, that's that. Oh, that's that. And I ask you to resist that for the 35, 45 minutes that you're watching these. Resist that, because the network of neurons wants familiarity. So it's going to take things and bucket them, because it just doesn't like the discomfort of there's something out there that they didn't understand. And most people who are over 50 have already worked out their own meaning of what subconscious is. And it doesn't have to mean it's right. They've worked it out. I had one person tell me that it's the higher self. The subconscious is the higher self, which is completely wrong, right? Sub is below. So the subconscious is below, but then it's not even a mind. It's a network of neurons, which is why it doesn't think. It just provides associations. And the reason why it seems so smart and effective, kind of like AI, is because it's super fast. It processes at 11 million bits per second. Same way when you put AI in, it's almost like it's been reading the text as you were typing it, because the answer comes so quickly. At 11 million bits per second, the subconscious is that fast. The network of neurons is that fast. The conscious mind is only 50 bits per second. And that's why people give their life over to the network of neurons, which is a mistake. By age 35, most people are living 95% of their lives by habit, and that's a mistake. I'm not going to say we need to be running only 20% by habit. I do say that our habits should be aligned with our life design, and not just what we had conditioned to from 0 to 7. And when you start looking at this topic, it makes a lot more sense in general, right? The neuroscience topic. it makes a lot more sense when you look at it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint, because as a hunter-gatherer, you can imagine that a person who's learning to hunt and gather from ages 0 to 7, it was probably no different than how they would hunt at age 35. And so for 10,000 years, these hunter-gatherer humans, we've evolved based on that. It's only been a couple of hundred years since we've had automobiles, and half a century since we've had computers. And when you consider that compared to the 10,000 years, it makes sense that our evolution has not caught up with what's going on. And because it's changing all the time, if you look up homeostasis and allostasis, you can see that the central nervous system is probably confused all the time, because it's always running into something that's unexpected. That creates anxiety, or I should say, triggers. It can trigger the anxiety. It triggers emotions or feelings, right? It triggers impulses, and those impulses lead to anxiety. I talked about that in the emotional modulation step 5 the day before yesterday. And you can find these lower in the platform that you're watching, but you could also go to the website, my landing page, 7-Step Reset with the digit, 7stepreset.com/live. And there I have yesterday's, and then yesterday's will be replaced by today's, because the other box is for the future. And then down below that, I have 4 videos that have to do with prior ones. So eventually you'll have all 7 steps plus an overview. And so you can always go watch. And that's why I'm doing these one step at a time. So there's at least one full video that talks about that step. Now, here's the 7-step reset. Let's move my screens around here. Seven-step reset I created because the 7 performance areas I created the 7-step reset because the 7 performance areas, we have to gain mastery over the mental, physical, spiritual before we could move on. If we don't have at least a baseline mastery, you don't have to be an expert at it, but you have to have a baseline capability in the mental, physical, spiritual for us to move forward and do anything with the emotional, and then even more so with the relationships, professional and financial. And so the 7-step reset is how we create the habits, because we want the automaticity working for us. Not that it works against us, it's that it's working for a prior time and place. When you were 0 to 7, you didn't know what you would be doing. What you're doing today for most of us is different than what we thought we would be doing from 0 to 7. 0 to 7, the conditioning, back to the hunter-gatherer example, is there to help us get along in the tribe, to find our place in the tribe, to make sure that we respect the chief. I read somewhere that that's why that public speaking is the number one fear for many people, because speaking up incorrectly to the chief could get somebody killed. And that's why this fear of public speaking is there. Could be true. So as I said, a lot of these habits and idiosyncrasies make sense when you go back to the hunter-gatherer time. And then once we have this under somewhat control, we're able to then take that out to the real world, so to speak, and influence other people, because now relationships are not going to trigger us. Things that happen professionally are not going to trigger us. Things that happen financially are not going to trigger us. It's just life. It's just stuff happening, but we're centered here. And that's why I call emotional the gateway. The emotional is the gateway to the right side. You can do everything right over here and then get hijacked. And the same way trust is built on the escalator going up, but can be lost jumping out the window going down. That's what happens here at the emotional. I've seen people get up and leave meetings and quit on the spot because they just couldn't handle the internal tension. They were being triggered. Maybe something happened that brought up some trauma from the past. Who knows? But that you want to have a handle on that if you have big goals and dreams over here. If you don't have big goals and dreams over here, none of this makes sense. You're probably not even watching it. It didn't even show up on your feed. But if you do have big dreams over here, especially if they're bigger than you, we have to fix this. And that's why I make sure that something is bigger. So sometimes what I'll do is once they have their quest and they've got it figured out, we 10X it. What does that look like if you 10X? Oh, I can't. 10X is impossible. if it's impossible and we can't find any examples that somebody's 10x that goal, right? So let's look at, and I'll find a goal, just do a quick Google search. You'll find somebody who 10x something that's very similar to what they're doing. Now that's removed that obstacle. So now we go back to it. So what does this look like? I'm not saying you have to go 10x, but what does this look like? And once they design the 10x, now we have something big enough because we can get their heart engaged. And usually the reason for the 10x is some fear. And that's why the first step of the model is to the first step of the model is beliefs, the neuroplasticity, priming, mindset, and physiology. So the beliefs, we have to get rid of or neutralize the limiting beliefs. We have to understand them. And it's not about taking the belief out, it's understanding where the belief came from so you make your own choice. All beliefs are based on some reference. And if there's no reference, then it was just based on conditioning that was given to you. And so we have to have references for any belief. You want to hold that standard that if I have a belief, I have to have references that stand the test of time on a bad day of a bad week. Otherwise, why have that belief? It's not really, doesn't work out to become qualified as a belief if you don't have that kind of reference for it. And then the command of neuroplasticity is creating the habits. I don't want to go too deep into here, but you get it. We want to prime ourselves versus being primed by somebody else. And the mindset is not just about a growth and fixed mindset. It's about being able to get back to a growth mindset in seconds, not minutes, not days, seconds. And then physiology, we have to have a courageous physiology versus a defeated, fearful physiology. Some of this should make sense. And then step 2 is the mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional state of being. What's your state? If you are already in a low HRV state, if you're in a high beta brainwave state, and those two kind of go together in a way, then the likelihood of you being able to meet that challenge that faces you in step 3, whatever that stimulus is, because you don't know what's coming, you're going to be less equipped to do that if you're in a low state of being, low energy, low positivity or negative state of being. And then self-image is the other one. And self-image, you can monitor that or gauge that by your self-talk. Is your self-talk super negative? If your self-talk is super negative, you're already defeated going into the stimulus. So these 2 steps here, that's what we can manage. We can't control the stimulus that's going to come. Now, some people do. I've heard of actors that on set that you can't look at them in the eye, that you have to move away and you can't be in the room when they come in. And some athletes do this too. They control their entire environment because they want to maintain that state. They want to be super ready for the state. They've learned this, but what they don't realize is that they are actually in more control of this. So rather than creating an environment where nobody could surprise me, what I want to do is create a system internally that no surprise is big enough to knock us off track. That's what we're going after. That's what the 7-step reset is about. Not that you're going to control your environment. I tried that. And you know what the problem is? When you have a system that's based on your environment being super perfect, impenetrable, when something does penetrate it, you're cooked because you don't have the skills. That happened to me. So I ended up losing my business in the pandemic. I probably would not have kept it, but the bigger point was I wanted something so perfect. It was a passion business. It was a global tourism business, motorcycle rental to people from around the world who wanted to ride across the country. Great. And you just, every year I had my business coming in, it was fine. And then a series of things happened, right? And then, of course, the pandemic, there was no travel. The travel business just disintegrated. And the profit margins weren't thick enough or wide enough or large enough. Or I could argue that I didn't do some of the right things. So my balance sheet wasn't big enough. But it turns out that I don't care how big my balance sheet was. I mean, many of the smaller private, like I was, the smaller rental companies went out of business just because of travel. And as a matter of fact, a couple of years ago, I went to Africa and I went out to the immigration sites, to do the visa thing and all that. And I just happened to look at the US site. And this was in 2023. And the rules for COVID were still there. So my point is, if anybody was looking at traveling to the United States and their reference was that immigration site, they probably didn't meet those rules for flying to the US. And so as a motorcycle renter who goes all around the world to rent, you just go to another country. more than you needed to know, but I wanted to just put that in perspective of having the perfect business is not the solution. Having the perfect environment is not the solution. What you need is a system that can react to no matter what happens, that you maintain your agency and personal leadership and can thrive regardless. So that's the first two steps. And then the 3, 4, 5, and 6, I'm not going to spend a lot of time there, but this happens very quickly. This is the stimulus. Then we have a reaction, but there's a pause because we don't want the reaction to equal the response. Response is step 4. And before we act on that response, we want to do a quick check-in and see emotionally where are we. Takes 0 to 90 seconds to process an emotion. We don't want to dwell or harbor it, because if we do, it becomes a neurobiological event, and now it's in our neurons and accessible for that next association. But this can be 0 seconds. And then step 6 is action. So once you get this resolved and you're not triggered by solving this over here, you're not going to be triggered and you're not going to be in fight or flight. In fact, I'm not some special person. I don't experience fight or flight. See, I knew that was possible because in Ranger training, they essentially train that out of you. So you don't get fight or flight in Ranger school or in Navy SEAL school. It works itself out of you. The fight or flight just burns out, and then you're able to rebuild. So I knew it was possible, and that's a part of what was my litmus test for these steps, to make sure that it works at that level, and it does. So once you have that agency over here, you're less likely to be triggered. You're not going to be seeing fight or flight. You're not going to have the need for emotional modulation. That goes way down. And then your actions can be pure out of your consciousness. So today what we're going to do is work on steps 7, and I'm going to talk about it in the context of 1 and 2. And this is the backdrop. You can't stop the 33,000 You can't stop the 33,000 decisions that we're making every day. But what you can do is create some space that allows you to ignore some of them. So the 33,000 decisions a day, and you can look this up. Everything I'm telling you could search on Google. I work hard not to use neuroscience terminology because I want it to be easily accessible. The one that I do use is the reticular activating system, because the reticular activating system is the bridge between the 11 million bits per second that the network of neurons, aka subconscious, can process versus the 50 bits per second that the conscious mind. So the reticular activating system, often referred to as the RAS, filters and takes from the 11 million bits and gives per second, and gives the conscious mind what it understands the conscious mind to say is important. It's all physiological. This is not the mind. It's all physiological. And so you have to train the reticular activating system. So when I talk about we have to do training inside that step 3, what we're doing is training the bias, and we're also training the reticular activating system action so that the conscious mind gets what it needs. Essentially, I'm taking instead of just reacting and then the conscious mind wanting to respond with that reaction, there's a gap in there that we condition the reticular activating system to literally, because there's 11 million bits per second. So in a quarter of a second, it can do 500,000 bits. So in that quarter of a second, it's taking the stimulus and creating the first step of problem solving, which is clearly define the problem. This may sound like woo-woo, mystical, mumbo jumbo, but it's not. Just do the math. If the subconscious can process at 11 million bits per second, it comes online in a quarter of a second. That's the reaction time. The conscious mind can process at 50 bits per second. It doesn't come online until a half second. So there's a gap between the subconscious and the conscious, and that gap is where we can use that quarter of a second to provide what I'm calling that first step of problem solving, clearly define the problem, and handing that off to the conscious mind. If you think it's not possible to condition it, then you have to go back and say, well, how was I conditioned in the first place? And we use the same conditioning approach from 0 to 7, and we can use it at age 50. The difference is it takes a little bit more work. The same way learning a language later in life takes more work, but you can learn it. And that language is a good example of how you can retrain your conditioning. Now, let's look at this approach that I want to. So we're going to go here. If you start with the 33,000 decisions a day, and I also will add to that, it's actually more like 100,000 stimulus response cycles per day. And the reason I say that is because if you look up how many micro stimulus response cycles in a second, you're going to get some number that's probably higher than 2, certainly higher than 1, which means every second we can have a couple of stimulus response cycles, which are subtopics to the 33,000, these part of the 33,000. We're awake about 65,000 seconds a day. So that gives us every other second we have a decision. And those decisions obviously are not real decisions, conscious decisions, because 95% of everything we do is done by habit. And so that 95% tells us why that we can't remember over 30,000. We can't remember 30,000 of them because it's happening by habit. That's the network of neurons. And then the 100,000, because we're awake about 65,000 seconds a day and we're seeing more than one stimulus response cycle per second. That's where I'm getting 100,000 stimulus response cycles a day. And all of this, of course, leads to the 95% of everything we do is done by habit. Now, I don't want to necessarily break down that or change that. What I want to do is have the automaticity working for me, as I said earlier. And to do that, just fix this contrast. So to do that, we have to reset the conditioning. Again, from 0 to 7, that conditioning probably worked well for a hunter-gatherer 10,000 years ago. But what I learned from 0 to 7 really doesn't serve me, especially as a boomer, because we didn't even have computers in the home when I was growing up. In fact, I remember being in college when I got my first scientific calculator, because we were learning engineering using slide rules. And they didn't allow calculators. And then when the TI, Texas Instruments scientific calculator, became available, the upper classes, they started allowing calculators. And I remember saying, wow, this is going to really speed up design. It's really going to speed up engineering, because it took so long to do a problem with the slide rule. And now the Texas Instruments calculator just handed it to you. So that was my first experience. It wasn't a computer, but it was like the speed of a computer. I could do one engineering problem in the time it took me to, I could do 10 of them in the time it took me to do one. Now, you got the idea of the 7 steps, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And the 7th step is the mindfulness. And by the way, if you look at this, it actually 3 to 7, the stimulus and the response, stimulus reaction and the response, and the emotional modulation and the action, and it spells screams. So we don't want to stimulus conditioned reaction. It spells scream. So you got the stimulus and the conditioned reaction, and then you have response, emotional modulation, action, and mindfulness, getting back to this state over here. So we don't want to have this. What I'm going to do is look at step 7, 1, and 2. And we're going to call this the present moment. And then we're going to take steps 3, 4, 5, and 6. And we're going to call these the stimulus, action. Now, as I said, we're doing this about 33,000 times a day. And this is happening over and over and over. In the motorcycle business, I was renting motorcycles, and people would come from around the world and take my bikes out. And it's all about twisties. So if you live in a mountainous area, you know that motorcycles love to be out Sunday morning riding the twisties. Well, there's a lot of twisties on the western part of the United States because you have the Sierras, you have the Rockies, etc. And people would ride those mountains. I had a lot of people who would ride to Colorado and then ride back because they just wanted to be in the twisties. They weren't interested in the long, flat roads. You do have nice mountains in Pennsylvania and the Blue Ridge Parkway, et cetera, in Virginia and North Carolina, but the great twisties are in where there's great mountains. In California, surrounded by mountains because we have that whole ridge line of the coastal mountains, and then you have the Sierras, which is a big thing. So you have these triangles that you can do, these loops that you can do. Literally, you can ride for 10 days and be on a different set of twisties every day. And that was the idea. So I started looking into that. Why is this such a big thing? And I rode the twisties all the time. I mean, that's why I was in, it's called sport touring, by the way. So touring is mainly on the highway. Touring, sport bikes like twist racetrack, and then sport touring would be combining those two. So we're doing spirited riding. And I was like, why is it so addictive? People would be dropping $10,000 on a vacation to ride a motorcycle over some roads, knowing that there's risks, right? They can have accidents, animals, the motorcycle could break down. Some people didn't even know the language. I had a couple ride from California to New York who didn't speak any English. But it was so addictive. And I started looking into this, and it wasn't until I got my one wheel that it clicked. I mean, I had clues. I had a friend who did his blood pressure before he went out on a 3-hour twisty ride and came back, and because he had high blood pressure problems, came back, and the blood pressure was way down after the 3 hours. His wife was in the medical industry, and she's the one who suggested that he do that. And it started like all these data points were sitting there, and I would be holding these open loops. And then when I started riding the one wheel, especially learning, it's so easy to crash on to have a nosedive on those things because it's just one wheel. So if you hit a bump that you don't see, you're not ready to absorb it. It trips. And when it trips, that front edge goes into the ground and you plow into the ground without a chance. Like if you fall off a skateboard, you can often take a few steps and save yourself. When it on the one wheel, you're gone. So anyway, long story short, right? What I learned riding the one wheel was how I was getting separation between my conscious mind and what my network of neurons, aka subconscious. There was a space there because my subconscious was so preoccupied looking for bumps and cracks and anything that could hurt me. And if you put all this together, if I'm in the twisties for 4 or 5 hours, I am so focused because the turns are blind, the road, you don't know the road, there's cars coming. You have 3 or 4 hours where the subconscious chatter is just quieted down, it's just gone. And the same thing was happening with the one wheel. I would ride for maybe an hour at a time, and I would notice there's no subconscious chatter I could work out problems because the subconscious noise wasn't there. So this is interesting. Well, and the third data point I'll give you is that when you meditate, it's putting you into this space where you're here. You're more in this area, right? You're gently bringing your mind back when it wanders. You're ignoring the impulses that come up like from the subconscious. So what ends up happening, our 33,000 decisions, I'm making this part up, the 33,000 decisions or major stimulus response cycles per day get reduced, and I'm making this up again, it's 20,000, goes down to 20,000 because we've expanded the time we're spending in step 7, 1, and 2. 7 is mindfulness, getting back to the present moment. 1 is working on our own priming and our mindset, making sure we're in a growth mindset and command of our neuroplasticity, engaging in deep practice and honing our positive beliefs. And then step 2 is checking in on our state of being. We're working on having a positive self-image, a good mental, physical, spiritual, emotional state. And then what we've done is we've reduced the stimulus action part. It's not that we've changed the outside world, because while we're meditating, the outside world is still going on. We're just not paying attention to it. So remember the reticular activating system. The reticular activating system comes and tells us what's important. And during this period of time, it's not giving us any information because we're in that meditative state. And then when we come out here, we start to see things. Well, advertising uses that reticular activating system so that the reticular activating system notices the headline. So if you have a goal, you may notice this happens. People think they've manifested it. If you have a goal, you'll start seeing headlines that are related to that goal. Or if you're concerned, you start seeing news headlines that feed that concern. So advertising, they bring up a problem, they amplify it, stir it up, make it real to you, and that expands your stimulus reaction. While you're meditating, you're not seeing those stimuli. So that's one thing that's happening. The other thing is by focusing on your purpose, this is why it's so important to focus on your purpose, something bigger than yourself. You're giving your reticular activating system, you're telling it what to focus on. And because you're focused on your purpose, it's not even seeing some of these other stimuli that come in. So 4 years ago, I saw a stat that said we see about 5,000 ad stimuli per day. Well, now with AI writing ads, and I've noticed across all the platforms, there's more advertising, obviously, and more platforms are coming online. We're probably up to 7,000 or 8,000 per day, and we don't see those. Those obviously feed into the 33,000 decisions per day, or the stimulus response cycles. But if we're being bombarded with almost 10,000 ad stimuli per day, and now you have a purpose that says none of those things are important because only this thing is important, we're expanding the time that we're in our mindfulness or our consciousness state. And we're reducing the amount of time that we're in a responsive state. And that helps us reduce the amount of time that we're in a reactive state. So this is what happens over the 90-day reset. This is not knowledge. This is training. This is association. We are retraining your subconscious, retraining your network of neurons to do it the way that serves you rather than the way that is seeming to be running the world, which is reacting to stimuli. And those stimuli often are to get you to do something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. Tomorrow, I'm going to pull this together this step 7. I want to stay on it for another day. And I'm going to use some infographics that you can take with you that help you see why and how the step 7, 1, and 2 are so important. The most the thing I do that serves this process more than anything is I have a morning 10 minutes that I spend. And that 10 minutes, I hydrate because I've been asleep for whatever, right? And so my brain is my blood is dehydrated. This thins the blood. Thin blood moves faster and more easily. The brain needs nutrients. The brain uses fully 20%, 25% of our basal metabolism. And so it's starving for nutrients, starving for oxygen, starving for as I said, the nutrients and oxygen, and it gets that through the blood. And so by thinning the blood, it gets those nutrients and oxygen more easily. The other thing I do is breathe. Breathing cleanses the blood. When the blood is, for lack of a better term, toxic, it it biases us more to fight or flight. If you have toxicity in your blood, you are already compromised. And when we're compromised, our cells go into protective mode. And when we're in protective mode, we're preparing for fight or flight. Cortisol is running through the body and all that. So breathing cleanses the blood. By the way, movement does as well, because the lymphatic system, lymphatic fluids don't have a pump. They move with movement. So movement cleanses the blood as well. And remember, I said we live seconds without blood, minutes without oxygen, and days without water. So we're taking care of those two things right here in this. I do 10 minutes. I think you could see changes with 5. And then the last one is purpose. I remind myself what's important. Remind my conscious mind of what's important. And by doing this, I'm priming myself for the day. I also can work out like what I want to do that day. Sometimes, because I go live every day, sometimes in that 10 minutes, I will think about different angles that I want to use. And sometimes I'll use them, sometimes I don't. But the idea is that I do this 10 minutes before I do anything. And then my planning happens after that. By the way, on the breathing, what I do is I'm up to 14 counts now, 14 seconds, inhale and exhale. I'll go to 15. Once I get to 15 seconds, sometimes I do 20, but I'll only do it for 5 minutes, 20 seconds. What's really useful is box breathing. Box breathing is, they're all, you can go down a rabbit hole of breathing techniques, but box breathing is really good because it sets your vagal tone and sort of helps you into that consciousness state. But I like the 14 seconds and / 15 seconds because what it does is it's giving me an anchor so that if I am hit with some kind of a quote unquote threat, that all I have to do is start breathing. And it doesn't take 15 seconds because remember, the processing is so fast. Just the first half second, the first second of my breathing is reminding myself about that conscious state. Is like an anchor to that state, and it gives me a chance to step into my purpose, and the purpose outweighs whatever stimulus is coming. So this is that page is that process is probably one of the most important things I do. I've tried many different rituals. so many different rituals. And what I've learned over the years is that, because I've listened to this guru and that guru, read that book, etc. Many of your rituals are specific to what's going on at the time. There are better rituals when I'm in project mode, when I'm creating and innovating. Those rituals don't serve me as well when I'm in operating mode. So I'm in this going live daily is like operating mode. I do this because ski season. I want something simple that I can do and still ski, so I can get up in the hotel and I can do my live event and then go out and ski, etc. And so I want to have something that's simple. So my operational, and I would say operation in this way is much simpler than the innovation, because the innovation requires more testing and research and trial and error, et cetera, and working things out. Whereas this live event is over in an hour. So my rituals are different. So this 10-minute ritual is really useful when I'm in operational mode. When I'm in innovation mode, I might do longer. I may spend more time walking. I may spend more time recording thoughts and working through. The ritual is different. I may just go down rabbit holes, research rabbit holes for the first hour of the day, and let that kind of wash over me. And then I create understanding later on. More than you wanted to know, but my point is there are operational rituals, in my view, and there are project beneficial rituals. This one is a keeper. I'm probably going to do this for the rest of my life. Not the breathing, the uh, hydrate, deep breathing, and then reminding myself of my purpose. It's like a mini meditation. And tomorrow I'll talk about how to get from where you are to where you want to be through meditation. So we're going to start with this 7-1-2, and then 3-4-5-6, and work on expanding the 7-1-2. That's tomorrow's topic, and that'll close out the 7 steps, doing it individually. And then next week on Monday, we'll start back again with the overview and more, start moving into application. Again, you can always join me online using the code that I put in the chat. That link changes every day, but if you click that link, you'll be invited onto stage. I'll see you there, and I'll let you in. We can talk about it, or you can ask questions in the chat, and I'll use those to dive deeper into the topics. That's it. I'll see you tomorrow, 8 a.m., and you can find past episodes on 7stepreset.com/live, and that's 7 with the digit.